All right, Bigfoot Society, we've got Curtis Miller, David Fuller, and Candy Fuller back this time. You might remember Curtis and David from an earlier episode. Of course, they are the two doctors that we had on, and the episode that we had about their adventures throughout, I believe it was California and the Pacific Northwest, specifically Gypsy Meadows. They had said that later on in the year, they were going to be going out again. And so a lot of listeners reached out to me. They were like, hey, are we going to have Curtis and David back on to figure out what happened to these guys? I'm happy to say that we have them both on, and we've got Candy along for the ride this time as well, because Candy was up there with them this time too, correct?
Yes.
Yep.
Perfect.
Yes.
Before we get started, just so that our audio listeners can figure out voices, do you mind if I'll have Curtis say a few words first?
Thanks for having us, Jeremiah. It's good to be back.
Absolutely. And David?
Hey, thanks, Jeremiah. It's good to be back. We had a really interesting year.
And Candy?
Thanks for having me for my first time. This is going to be very interesting and a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Guys, last time we talked it was a good 2 hours. It was a pretty solid one. Is there any way to maybe do a really basic foundation about what you guys have been through so far? I don't know if that's even possible to do in a few minutes.
You mean from our first trip, 2022? And
yeah.
Now?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sure. David and I got into Bigfoot on a whim. I had been to Nepal and seen the Pangboche Yeti, and I knew David had an interest in Bigfoot, so we decided to go Bigfooting in 2022, and we're basically rookies, but just a quick summary of that trip. We went to the Siskiyou Wilderness in Northern California. As the crow flies, we were probably 20 to 25 miles away from Bluff Creek, but while we were there for a whole week, we found a number of tree structures. We found trees that were suspended by other trees, just almost as if they were floating in the air. Obviously, they were being held by vines and things like that. We found a big igloo structure that seemed like a primitive shelter, did not appear to be occupied by humans, and there was a number of piles of large scat that were around it. While we were there, we also found 16-inch footprints, and then our last day before we left, we had pine cones thrown at us. So that was quite a memorable trip. We didn't get back into it until 2024 in August. We decided this time to go to a different place. And after watching a number of people on YouTube, we chose to go to Northeastern Washington near the Salmo Priest Wilderness to a place called Gypsy Meadows. And if you remember, there we also found 16.5-inch footprints. We found a pretty good X structure that seems pretty amazing, very symmetrical, and happened to be pretty strategic in its location. We had a number of vocalizations. A lot of them were associated with barred owls, and we can talk a little bit about that later. And then one of our fellow campers about 1/8 of a mile away from us had a Class A sighting of a Bigfoot that David and I missed by probably 30 seconds. And we have a little update on that later on in the talk. And after that trip, Jonathan Brown, who you know of, heard of our trip, and he started talking to us via text and phone conversations, and he wanted to get together with us to film us and interview us regarding that trip to Gypsy Meadows. And then after that, we were on podcast with Matt Knapp, and then subsequently on your podcast. The experience of meeting Jonathan Brown and eventually Sarah Brown, and then you and Matt Knapp, has introduced us to a whole probably 10 or 15 contacts that we wouldn't have had otherwise. David and I are still rookies in this, but we have a number of people that we can send things to that would have never happened had we not been on your podcast or Matt's podcast. So that's neat. And in fact, we've had some people reach out to us to get our opinion on some things that have to do with anatomy, because if you remember, we're both doctors. So that's neat. Here we are, rookies, and we have people sending us videos, asking us questions about anatomy. So that was our background up until this last year. If you remember, when you were interviewing us, you asked us what our future plans were. And I think we said on Saturday, we're going back to Gypsy Meadows. And that was June of 2025. And that was our first trip this year.
Yeah. So as like Curtis said, Jonathan and Sarah Brown of Salish Sasquatch, they wanted to film us. So we went up to Gypsy Meadows. It was a lot of snow up there. And so it didn't clear out until April. And so we decided to go up in June. And so Sarah and John invited Will Omer, who was Grassman 58 on YouTube, and because that was his research area, and they wanted to film some of his stories. And then he invited Marshall White, which is Bushcraft Explorer on YouTube, and along with Aaron West was a friend of them, and both of them have been on their videos. But Will and Marshall showed up on Wednesday, and Sarah and Jonathan were coming in on Friday. Because we're driving so far, it's like a 2,000-mile round trip. We decided not just to go up for the weekend, but we went up earlier, and we decided to go up to the NABC and go around Mount Hood and maybe do another site on the way up because we weren't supposed to be up there till Wednesday. Candy had some interest in Bigfoot and enjoys camping, so she wanted to go. And then Curtis's wife after that decided she would go, but she couldn't come in until Wednesday. So we picked her up in Spokane. And I'll let Candy describe how she got interested.
I got interested because number one, I didn't have a choice because I'm living with who pretty much day and night we've been watching videos, listening to YouTube's podcasts. So I decided I might as well go along and see if I can hear things and see things that might get me right on along with these two guys in believing that there's possibly a Bigfoot out there. So because of all the stuff that I have seen in the last, 2 years, it has really sparked my interest, and going with them was really a lot of fun. And I really did enjoy it, to the fact that I would really like to go back. I'd like to go all over the United States if possible. That would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the dream, right? To go all over the United States and do Bigfoot stuff, like how finding Bigfoot did back in the day, I think. But yeah, feel free to continue, guys.
So as we were driving up that Saturday, as David said, we had about 1,000 miles to get to Gypsy Meadows from David's house. We were texting Jonathan Brown because he was going to meet us on Friday. And he told us Sarah had just gotten back from Gifford Pinchot. And while she was there, she recorded a number of vocalizations in this one specific campground. And it seemed like the campground was surrounded by things that were doing vocalizations. And he even sent us a copy of that audio. And our plan had been to go to the NABC and then probably go to Mount Hood. But once we heard that audio, we decided to go to Gifford Pinchot National Forest instead and go to that campground. And the morning we got to the campground, Jonathan called us or texted us, I can't remember which, and he's told us that the camp host had just called him and said that Sarah had heard that vocalization and recorded it 2 nights before, but the camp host had been sitting the night she left in his trailer, and he heard monkey chatter right outside his trailer. So that was interesting. And we got there, we met the camp host, and he said, yeah, it happened again the night before we arrived. So 2 nights in a row, both he and his wife had heard monkey chatter, and his wife had said that she heard it. The TV was playing. At first, she thought it might be on the TV, so she turned the TV down, and then it stopped. And when she turned the audio back on the TV, the monkey chatter happened again right outside her trailer. And she did that 2 or 3 times, just turning the volume down and everything would stop. But as soon as the volume of the TV went up, the monkey chatter started again. So that was neat that for 2 days in a row before we got there, and then maybe 3 or 4 days before we got there, all these vocalizations had occurred. And that first night that we were there, about 12:30, and at 1 o'clock, we heard some vocalizations. We have them on audio. Mostly they sound like barred owls, and there are a lot of barred owls in the area. But we did have one high-pitched sort of scream that lasted about 3 seconds. And once we got that on audio, we went and reviewed Sarah's audio that she had sent us. And one of the vocalizations that had occurred in her maybe 30 or 40-second audio was a very similar sound to that high-pitched scream that we heard. So that was neat to get that. One other thing that happened, I told you about us getting to meet people that we would have never met otherwise had we not been on all your podcasts. Jonathan arranged for us to meet a couple of BFRO people that were up there. They were there for the next weekend to host a BFRO camp out, but they were there a few days early to scout the area and talk to locals. So that was neat that we were going to be able to meet those guys as well.
So the next morning we got up, we decided, okay, what are we going to do? We were there for a couple of days. So we just looked on the map and found some forest roads and say, hey, let's go driving. So we went driving up this forest road that was a couple miles up from the camp. And as we're driving along, I see this harvested area of wood is probably 100 yards wide, maybe 500 yards deep or so, that went up a hill. And I was like, hey, that's fresh dirt. Let's check that out. So we stopped in there, walked up, and we're looking along the edge of it. And so I go, hey, Kurt, come look at this. I found two tracks that were coming perpendicular to the area in the soft dirt on the side. There was like soft dirt and then hard where cars or tractors or whatever had gone, and then soft dirt on the side. And so we had two 14-inch prints. There were 14 by 6-inch prints there. And the step length was 50 inches, which was a pretty big step length. And the elevation change was probably maybe 6 inches. So it could have been a normal flat, would have been a little less than that, but not much. But 50 inches was a pretty big step length at that. So we scanned it. We used a scanner, and then we casted that print, and it turned out pretty well.
And while David was casting, we noted that there was an X structure very close to where these prints had come out of the wilderness. And maybe the X structure was natural, I don't know, but it was just interesting that it was right where the prints came out onto this dirt area. And then we also noticed that whole dirt area that David was talking about, that was parking lot size, had been scraped out of the forest. Everything was out of it, all the sticks and trees. But we found one little log, probably about 2 feet in diameter, that was sitting in the middle of that cleared out area. And on top of that were 4 or 5 rocks stacked on top of each other. And then on top of that, there was a branch maybe 4 feet long that was balancing on top of the rocks. Now, it's not to say a human couldn't have done that, but it was all near this X structure and where David had found these prints. And then also while he was mixing up plaster of Paris, we started hearing chatter coming from up the ridge just behind the X structure. And this was essentially the first road from our campground. It was about, like David said, a couple miles up the road. There were no other roads that appeared to go off that would have gone up to there, and there didn't appear to be any trails. And we started listening. So how somebody got there, I don't know. It seemed to be in the wilderness. But we started listening to the chatter, and it sounded like women talking. And we couldn't make out what was being said, whether it was a foreign language or not. And this probably only lasted for about 20 seconds or so, but it came basically up the ridge right behind where David was casting this print.
While David was doing the casting, I decided that I wanted to walk on the other side of the hard dirt and see if maybe I could find something on the other side to see if maybe it had continued walking in that direction. And it took me, 30 seconds, and I found 2 more footprints. So I had the guys come over, they looked at them, they measured them, and they were the exact same length as the first 2 that David had found coming down off of the mountain. So that was pretty exciting for me. So that was 4 prints all in one in my second day of going out and looking for Bigfoot. So that was really exciting for me.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, that's the cast from the Gifford Pinchot place.
Most listeners are on board with us about Gifford Pinchot National Forest. It's a big place. I mean, it goes all over. Are you able to share if you were on one side more than the other, or is this a place where we're keeping it under wraps because it's an active research area in a way?
We've been asked to keep the specific name under wraps. This is basically the same area where those two unfortunate men passed away Christmas Eve. So it's the same basic area. Our whole time we were in Gifford Pinchot from Sunday to Wednesday, we basically were within a 5-mile radius of that area.
Candy, you had, I remember the first time that I found a Bigfoot track, it was the coolest thing. It was like, how did you feel in that moment where you're like, oh, I found something, there it is?
Well, when I found it, of course, I didn't say anything right away because I had to look around, see if I could find another one. One to me just seemed like it would be a little weird in that area. It seemed like there should have been at least one more, maybe two more. So yeah, I walked around, looked at it from all different angles, and then I realized that is what I'm looking at. I am looking at a footprint, a foot track. So it was, all right, you guys, I think I found some more. And that was the very beginning of my, okay, let's keep going. I need to find some more stuff. I want to hear some more stuff. So it really got my juices flowing in that.
While that cast was hardening, I left it harden for about a couple more hours. We decided to go drive further up the road. As we're driving along, I saw a structure on the right-hand side. So I stopped and got out and looked at it. But what I noticed was that these sticks were leaning up against a tree, but the small parts of the branches were down and the large were up. And so that was pretty interesting to me. And I go looked on there and I grabbed some of them and I pulled them up and they were jammed in the ground. And as I looked around, I saw a game trail going right by there and it made a right-hand turn right at that area and we headed towards the road. And then right across the road from there, we saw another X structure at that area. Jonathan had told us that those two Bigfooters had died in that area before, 6 months before. So before sundown, we went driving down the road that they had told us about. And about 2/3 of the way up, we parked and there was no one else around. There was no other cars or anything. And Curtis was walking ahead of us about 100 yards. And then Candy had an interesting experience.
We were walking out there and I had done some whistling prior, just playing around. And I believe it was Curtis that said, hey, Candy, do a whistle. So I did a whistle and I got a response. And I decided, okay, I'm going to do another one. So I did another whistle. I got another response. And they're like, okay, do it one more time. So I did it for a third time and I got another response. And it was the exact same whistle as I whistled. And I don't know if I can whistle right at the moment because I have lost my voice, but I just went, and I got the exact same whistle back all 3 times. And that was very interesting.
Boy, I've seen that played out in Oregon, and that's one of those things where it makes you really question what's going on. Wow, this is really happening now. How far away would you feel that whistle was that was returned to you, Candy?
Oh, I would say it was maybe 100 yards, or if not less.
And I was 100 yards in front of them and I could hear it too. Probably if you had our two positions, it was in the middle of us and however far away, but we almost formed like a triangle. The two of, Candy and David were at one corner of the triangle. I was at the other, and whatever responded was at the third corner of the triangle.
That's very interesting.
So it started getting dark, dusk was coming. So it said, hey, let's get going. So we got back in the truck and we were driving out. And as we're driving out, I see a tree break. And I hadn't seen it on the way in. So it was a fresh break with the leaves at the end of the break were still green. And I got out of the truck to go check it out. And when I got out of the truck, I started walking over there. All of a sudden, I got this feeling, I need my gun. because as we were driving, I had taken my gun off in the truck and had left it there because we were right along the side of the road. I said, no, I need my gun. So I walked back and opened the car door, and Curtis and Candy are like, what's going on? I just said, I just need my gun. So I got my gun, put it in the holster, and then went back and started looking around and inspecting there.
And I didn't originally get out because my window was down and this was on my side of the truck. And I could see it clearly just by sticking my head out the window. And I saw David come back. And like he said, we asked, what are you doing? And he said, I need my gun. And I've known David for over 50 years. And he's a big guy. And I've seen him stop fights just with a look. And I've never seen him, I don't even know if this was scared, but I've never seen him flustered. And I could tell he was flustered when I said, what are you doing? And he said, I need my gun. And so I got out, and we just to the right of that picture, there's a little game trail, and we took that back.
So we walked back there, and we find there's a small meadow, only about 20 yards wide and maybe 50 yards long, but there's definitely some trampled down grass in that meadow, and it was something big had gone through there. So at that time I was like, yeah, I'm glad I got my gun.
This was probably only 100 yards or so, maybe 200 yards from where Candy got the whistles. And the trampled down area, David he studies tracking, and he can tell you what he saw, but it looked relatively fresh.
When you see walking through the meadow, you can see, depending how fresh it is, shine on the grass, and we could still see that. So it had not happened very much longer from the time we had been there. I don't know if the tree break happened at that time. I don't know. I know the tree break was fresh, but something had definitely walked through that meadow not too distant time from when we were there.
And this, everything that's happening here, this is, you said, a few miles away from that area where the two gentlemen went missing.
This was on the road. This is a road that they were on.
Yeah. Those whistles and that tree break were essentially in the area where they had parked, apparently what we were told by some of the locals and verified by the BFRO. One of the BFRO people was on search and rescue for the valley. He wasn't on their search and rescue, but he knows people who were, and they said that they had parked at the end of the road and walked in. And so we drove in about 1.5 miles. So we were essentially in the same area where they were, where the tree break was and where Candy got these whistles. Same basic road.
What were the sounds of the forest like in that area besides whistling?
At that time around the tree break, I didn't hear anything.
I didn't either.
It was just quiet.
I think that's what gave David the heebie-jeebies. There was.
I don't know.
When we got the whistles, I think they were probably just normal sounds, but David's right. It was completely silent when I got out of the truck. So later that night, we got some vocalizations about 1 a.m. They predominantly sounded like owls. So we didn't think much of it. I tend to be an early riser. I got up about 5, and David and Candy were still asleep. And most of the vocalizations we had came from the mountain across the main road from the campground. And this is also where Sarah said the vocalizations had started that she recorded. Now, she also got some on the other side of the campground. All of ours came from the mountain area. And I decided to go for a walk to see if I could get either up that mountain easily or try to look at it. And about 1/4 mile down the main road, I found a road that looked like it cut up into the mountain, and it went on the back side of the mountain. I walked up about 1.5 miles, I would say. Probably didn't get anywhere near the top of this mountain, but I'd probably climbed a couple 100 feet. And I'm looking and listening as I go up, and about 10 feet off the road, I saw a couple of bones, and I didn't think much of it, but I went and looked at them. And then I realized I know a little bit about anatomy. I'm an orthopedic surgeon. And this looked like the forequarter of a deer. So what was there was basically the shoulder blade of the deer and what would be equivalent to our upper arm or humerus. And then the forearm for us, radius and ulna, and then the paw. And they had been picked clean, but The interesting thing about it, there were no other bones around, and this was probably 10 feet off of the road that kind of cut up behind the mountain. They had been picked completely clean, and yet a scavenger hadn't come in and taken the bones away. They were literally anatomic, sitting there with no soft tissue, no ligaments, nothing holding them, but they were all lined up just like they would be in an anatomy class. Now, I don't know what that meant. I don't know if the animal died there, but no other bones were there. It was just interesting that basically the front quarter of this deer was 10 feet off the road. And then that morning, once David and Candy were up, we went and met those two people who were with the BFRO, and they told us a number of the stories, including the one about what happened on Christmas Eve. They gave us a little more information. And they said in their research they had talked to a number of people who lived in the area, a number of the locals. And basically the locals said that they called this Skookum Valley. That was the nickname they gave to it because there were a number of Sasquatch in the area. And they said that most of the Sasquatch were relatively friendly, I guess is the right term, at least tolerant of people. But they said there was one really angry Sasquatch male in the area who was known to throw rocks and bluff charge and stuff like that. So we got that story from the BFRO people.
And this is just accounts from people that live in the area, you're saying?
Correct.
Wow.
They then did research by contacting known people or known Bigfooters in the area and getting stories. And they said they talked to a number of people. In fact, one we'll talk about in a little bit. He came down and talked to us a little bit later in the week. But so that, yeah, they, I guess as part of their research, they try to find out things that happen in the area so they can pass them on to the campers that come. And also they know where to look and where to go at night and stuff like that. They had done research talking to locals.
So later on that afternoon, after we talked to them, we stopped by their camp, and then we decided we had such a good time at the forest road before, let's go up a different one. So we went back and went up a different forest road. So as we're driving along, we come around to this corner, and I see this road that goes off to the right, but it's gated. And I go, hey, that'd be a nice, easier hike. So we go on there, and it was an awesome road. There was no obstruction. You could walk easily, but it was gated. There was no one back there. And so we're walking down this road, and Curtis and I usually I call it tactical walking. Curtis calls it leapfrogging, but we usually where one person stops and listens while the other person goes about 20 yards ahead in case something happens while they're walking. And so when Candy and I would go ahead, Curtis would stay back, and Curtis heard something.
Yeah, we probably were maybe 200 yards on this road. I guess we ended up going about a mile, but about 200 yards in, the road was up against, on one side, a ridge that probably went up about 30 feet. And we'd walked most of the way in doing this tactical leapfrogging walk. And about 200 yards in, I started hearing something when David and Candy took off, and it was something walking up on the ridge, and it seemed to be paralleling them. And when I passed them on my turn, I whispered to them, we'll see what happens again. And I got maybe 20 or 30 yards in front of them and stopped, and they took off again, and the same thing happened. This happened about 4 or 5 times in a row, that you could literally hear something walking up on that 30-foot ridge, paralleling David and Candy. And they said they listened every time I would leapfrog them, and nothing ever happened when I went ahead of them, but it only happened when those two went ahead of me. So that was interesting. What it was, don't know, but something definitely paralleled them on this ridge.
So when Curtis told us about that, we decided to keep walking, looking to the left there, and down some game trails that I start following and going up in that area. And I think I mentioned to you the last time when we talked about me wanting to learn to communicate with Sasquatches.
Yes.
People had asked me about, what are you going to do when you see one? And I had been, for a few months now, they've all been laughing at me, but I've been learning a Native American Sign Language. And so when I go up these game trails and I think if someone's paralleling us, I go up there and I would do Native American Sign Language just to the woods. I didn't see anything, but hoping that they're watching or seeing things. So that was fun to get some of the practice in doing that. And I think that I would hope that maybe the generations of Sasquatches from the Native Americans, maybe they passed it on. So we did hear a few whistles as we're walking along that side. We went in about 1.5 miles, like Curtis said. It was awesome. It was quiet as far as normal wood sounds, things like that as we went on. We rested for a while, had some lunch and stuff. And when we came back, getting close to the truck, I heard some rock clacks to the right above in the same ridge area where we had heard the parallel stuff. So I grabbed a couple rocks from the trail and I clacked 2 clacks back, and I got a response of 2 clacks. And I clacked again, 3 clacks, and I get a response back of 3 clacks. And I clacked again, 2 clacks, I get response 2 clacks. That happened 3 different times, so I get 3 the same response back at the same time right before we're taking off that thing. So that was really cool to hear that, right as we're leaving that woods in that area.
And that evening in the campground, we were just relaxing right before sunset. And all the vocalizations we had heard the first couple of nights, like I said, were across the road. We were probably in the campground maybe 100 to 200 yards in from the main road. And so everything was on that mountain across the road where I found that forequarter of the deer. And so I would guesstimate the calls were probably 1/4 mile away, 1/2 mile away, something like that. But we're resting that evening in our campground, and all of a sudden we hear a whoop, and this whoop sounded like it was 50 yards away. Now the campground, it had a road that came off the main road, probably came in about 50 yards, maybe 100 yards. And then the campground formed a circle. And the circle, I would guess, is about 3/8 of a mile around. And most of the campsites were on the outside of the circle. And the inner portion of the circle was essentially forest. There were a couple of campsites in that center portion, but nobody camped there the whole time we were there. And it sounded like, if we could estimate where it was, that whatever made this call was in that center portion, so maybe just 200 feet away. So we grabbed our gear, and David started slowly walking through that center portion. Candy and I walked up the road maybe 75, 80 feet, and there was one of those open camp sites in the center of the circle. And we went into that because it was clear and we thought we could look around. But we didn't find anything, and I knew David was crossing that central portion of the circle, and so I backed out of the campground, jogged around to the other side in case he flushed something out. And we probably looked for a half hour or so, and it was getting dark. We never heard anything else, never saw anything else. So if something had been in that circle, it either hunkered down and hid when David started going through that area, or it left as soon as he started going through and was long gone. But that was interesting on our last evening. And then that night at 3 a.m., David and I were both awakened, and we thought we heard bipedal footsteps in our camp. Now, we don't have anything on our audio from that, and our game cameras were down by the creek. We unfortunately didn't have any game cameras pointing at our campground, but that was an interesting way to end our Gifford Pinchot experience.
Yeah, we had, like I said, the barred owls. There were barred owl sounds, but then they would change and get weird. So that was similar to what we had been heard in Gypsy Meadows also.
Yeah. That last evening, I told you that one of the locals had dropped by, and he came by that last evening. Jonathan Brown had told him we'd be there, and he came by, and he was a really neat guy to talk to. He had lived in the area all his life. He was probably in his late 50s, early 60s, I would guess. He said he had Bigfoot experiences ever since he was a teenager, hunting in the area. He was an outdoorsman, did a lot of hunting. Then he started telling us a number of stories, and they were all great. And then he says, hold on a second, I got to show you something. He went to his car or his truck and pulled out this long tube like you'd put a poster in, or maybe a rod if you're fishing, like a long cardboard tube. And he pulled out a map, and the map was probably 2.5 feet by 4 feet, and it was of the whole area. And he had documented all of his experiences on this map, where he'd had sightings vocalizations, footprints. He probably had, I would guess, 75 to 80 documents on this map of dots that were color coded. Here's where I saw one. Here's where I saw footprints. It was just amazing. And he basically, from that, his experience of being in the area for 45 years or so hunting, he believes, and looking at his map, I believe him, he knows the migrational pattern of these beings just based on the food sources in the area, when the berries are ripe, when the elk are around, when the deer are around. And it's just amazing the document that he has. So that afternoon, the next day, we finally decided it was time to go meet everybody at Gypsy Meadows. So we drove up there, picked up my wife in Spokane, and we drove up to Northeast Washington. And Sarah and Jonathan had, as David had said, had invited Will Ulmer and Marshall White because they had done a lot of on YouTube in the area. They hadn't actually been to Gypsy Meadows, but they had done a lot of research down along Sullivan Creek and Sullivan Lake, which are just below Gypsy Meadows. And so they came and we met them in the camp, talked to them around the campfire and got to know them. Then about 1 o'clock that morning, I was awakened by a loud knock that sounded like it was near our camp. I stayed awake for about a half hour. I didn't hear anything else. Never picked up that knock on my audio, which was probably 50 yards away. The next day, we hiked around the area with those guys, showing them some of the things that we had seen the previous year, including that X structure and where other things had been, where that one gentleman had seen the Bigfoot and that kind of thing. Spent the day doing that.
So I sent you the picture of Gypsy Meadow campsite so you can get a sense of what it's like there. I mean, that afternoon, after we had shown him the X structure, I went and decided to go take a nap and actually went to Candy's hammock and just resting there. And all of a sudden I hear this thud like right behind me. It's 8 feet behind me. And when I go and look, I'm looking around, that's a rock. And I go, is there some more going to come? And I actually go look around, and most rocks are embedded in the forest bed and the needles and stuff. But there was one rock that was clean that was right about 8 feet away from my head. And I picked it up and threw it up in the air and let it land so I could see if it sounded the same. And it did. That I brought home, and it's sitting on my mantle over here. For it.
Candy loves the decoration.
Yeah, it's there for everyone to see. Yes.
Real quick, so Candy, at this point, so I'm speaking from experience. When I started to get into what I guess you'd call field work and like going out there into the field and not just like watching YouTube videos about it, you get to a point where you have something happen where it's really pushes you over the edge and past 100%. Okay, this is real. Was that something that, did you ever get to that experience, or is that something that maybe we haven't talked about yet, or it is yet to come for you?
We haven't talked about it yet.
Okay, so we'll talk about it in a little bit.
It is coming. It is
Okay.
It's coming.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So the meadow has 3 campsites, and Will, Marshall, and us took up all the campsites there. So that evening before dinner, about 30 minutes, it was right after someone had thrown a rock by my head. Will and Marshall come over, and they're hearing owl hoots and a loud knock from across the road. And the same year, the previous, that we had heard the same group where I had called samurai or Sierra sounds go running through there, and it ran up that ridge. So when Will came over and told us he had heard that, we grabbed our gear and took off and went up towards that ridge up behind Marshall's camp. As soon as we got up on the main road, we get up there. Also, we hear these 2 low grunts or woo sounds as we come up on the road. So we went across the main road. We started climbing up the mountain across there. And it's a really steep angle, is difficult to climb. But about 75 feet up the mountain, Will found another X structure. And I think I sent a picture of that one. It was right in line with the other one that we had found the year before, right behind our camp. But you couldn't see it from the road, but definitely we got into that tree line, that's where he had found it. So we kept climbing, and about 50 more vertical feet up above that X, Curtis found something that was really interesting.
As David said, Will found this X, and it seemed to be in line with the other X we had found the year before. Wasn't quite as big, but we kept going up the hill. And I think you have my video that was from my GoPro on my chest pack. When we got to a certain area, we probably went up, like David said, another 50 to 75 vertical feet. And in the video, you can't really, it doesn't give you an appreciation of the steepness, but it was probably 45 or 50 degrees up. So every step forward, you'd go up a foot, or every foot forward, you go up a foot, basically. And so we got up, like I said, about 50 to 75 more feet. And I came to this log, and I realized if it was on flat ground, I could probably easily step up on that log and just keep going. Since it was at a 45-degree angle above me, I decided to take a quick turn to the left. And I probably went about 15, 20 feet. And all of a sudden I saw a number of pine boughs, and they were all fresh. And I saw them from a distance, and I got closer, and all the pine boughs were arranged in a circle. And David I called him over, and he looked at him. I called Will over, and David realized that some of the pine boughs were actually weaved together. There was one long one that essentially had been bent and interwoven, so it went about halfway around the circle. And then in the center of the circle was a depression that literally looked like, for lack of a better term, two butt cheeks. And then we turned around and looked down the hill, and this was essentially in line with that second X. And we looked further, and we could see the road through the break in the trees. Now, you could not see this from the road, because it's that old saying, you can't see the forest for the trees. But when you were in the trees, you could see through breaks, you could see the road. So this was a perfect observation point to watch the road. And then we looked even further, and we were high enough up the mountain that you could look over the top of the trees that were between our camp and the main road, and you could see the far side of the meadow. Not very much of it, but you could see the creek and just maybe a few feet of the meadow itself. So from that position of that picture that you see there, you could observe the road, and you could observe a portion of the meadow. So that was crazy to find this thing. And the year before and this year, we had always heard things up on that ridge. And this was a flat area. I know that I said it was mostly vertical, but this was maybe a 6 by 10 foot area that was just flat. I don't know if it was naturally flat or it had been made flat, but these pine boughs were interwoven to create a seat. It wasn't big enough for anything to sleep in. It wasn't a nest. It was probably, what would you say, David, maybe 4.5, 5 feet across, something like that?
Yeah, it was probably five feet across. And the other, if you remember, Kurt, the interesting thing is that Will was looking around, and he actually found knuckle imprints on the side. If someone would you put your knuckles on the ground to
push up
on the side of that seat, or perch as we call it, that's where the knuckle prints were.
I'm gonna play that video real quick of the same area.
Can I imagine it, or is that a place to sit? It doesn't look like a place to lay down, but it might be a place to sit. And we saw that car go by, so you can see the road.
Lined up with the X there.
Yeah, yeah.
That one comes all the way around.
It may not be, but I don't know.
That is so cool. Oh man, so that's you two guys, and Will's with you right there?
Yes.
Yeah, that's Will.
Marshall, he was with us as well, but he was further up the mountain. After we found that, we documented it with pictures. We did not cast it. Marshall had gone further ahead, and we caught up with him, and we eventually came to a rock wall that we couldn't get past. So we didn't go any further. It was starting to get a little close to dark. So we went back to our camp and split up for dinner. And while Will and Marshall were in their campsite eating dinner, they heard whoops coming from that area. And then later that night, we were all around the campfire, which is kind of what we tended to do in the evenings. And while we were around the campfire, a rock hit a tree close to us. We don't have it on a recorder, but it hit a tree. And then probably 20 seconds after the rock hit the tree, we heard two knocks coming from up in that ridge where the pine boughs were formed in a circle there. They got a response shortly after we got down, maybe 20 minutes after, while they were eating dinner. And then later that evening, we got another response from up on that same ridge. And then about 2 a.m, I was awakened by predominantly, I think they were barred owls, or at least they sounded like barred owls, but they were going off, and they probably went for a minute or two, different ones calling from around the valley. And the reason I mention this is both in 2024 and then again this year on both of our trips, barred owl calls were associated with strange things that happened. So we came up with a couple of different theories. We talked to a number of people. Perhaps all the vocalizations we heard were barred owls. I mean, that is one option. A lot of people say barred owls can make weird calls. Most of the calls may have been barred owls, but that would not explain the Sierra sounds that David heard. And if you remember, the Sierra sounds that David heard were witnessed by another group of campers who were awakened that same night. And they said that whatever made those calls ran through their camp. So I don't think those were owls, but maybe the vast majority of the rest of the calls were owls. Our second theory is that Bigfoot is mimicking owls at some point. Maybe still most of the calls are owls, but we have had times where the calls degenerate into other calls. They go from the call of a barred owl to whoops, or a call of the barred owl to a whistle. Our third theory is perhaps Bigfoot is using the barred owl calls to mask their movements and or eventual calls like the whoops. Whatever is involved there, whether it's predominantly barred owls or Bigfoot, strangeness always seems to occur right afterwards. And about an hour or so after these calls I heard is when Candy became 100% of a believer.
Let's see if I can get you a little picture here. My husband decided that it would be really fun if he brought this little itty bitty tiny 2-man tent and put himself and myself in this tent. It was so small, if I turned to the left, my face would be smashed with the tent. So that night, I woke up a few times, should say in the middle of the night, woke up a few times, and I thought I could hear what seemed to be like really soft walking. And it was up behind our tent. I was awake. It was, I believe, just starting to get a little light outside. And I was laying on my right side, and I was looking at David, and I was trying to figure out how in the world can someone sleep on their stomach and snore so loud. And just so you know, that was the noise that I was hearing. But all of a sudden, I had something poke into the tent, push in on my thigh, and then released and went back out. And I just started hitting David, yelling at him, telling him to wake up. Something has just touched me through the tent. I could tell that it was not the nose of something, of an animal. It seemed flat and big. And when it pushed into my thigh, it pushed in gently. It wasn't a strong trying to hurt me. I didn't have that kind of a feeling, but it was enough that it really scared me. And so it took this guy about a minute to wake up, get turned over, unzip the tent, get the flashlight, then get his gun, then stand up, and we didn't see anything. There was nothing there. Needless to say, after that, the last 2 nights, I took our bags that had our clothes in them and I built a wall on that side of the tent. And so I slept between my bags and David. And the next time we're going, we're getting a nice, probably 7 to 8 man person tent so that I have room to sleep in the middle.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Wow. So now you're way into there's something real out there territory. Yeah, that would do it.
Yep.
My goodness.
Yep. That was very exciting.
So one thing that was interesting that later on Candy told me about was that at night she would go out, if she needed to go to the bathroom, she'd tend to go out behind the tent area, and it'd be a hole. She'd put her toilet paper in, but she found this volleyball-sized rock that she would put over the hole where the toilet paper went. And every time she went back, something had moved that rock about 2 feet to the side off the hole. And she would go back and she'd put it back when she was done, and it'd be moved again. And once she had told us that, we started putting a couple things together, wondering if whatever had been smelling that toilet paper had tracked her to the tent, and that had pushed to see if that's where the odor had been, or where she had tracked her odor to that area.
And interestingly, Terry would do the same thing, except she brought her toilet paper back to the campfire and threw it in the campfire every night. And so there was nothing left in the forest to smell and associate with her. So it's interesting that Candy's the one that got touched when her toilet paper was in the forest. And Will had set up his thermal that night, pointing right towards our camp. Unfortunately, David's big truck was between the thermal and the tent. So nothing ever showed up on Will's thermal.
Just like all other Bigfoot.
They just seem to know where the electronics are. So the next morning, all of us went on different hikes across into the wilderness. And you can get to the wilderness 2 different ways. You can either cross the creek, or at the end of the meadow, there's a trail. You eventually have to cross the creek too if you go through the trail. But the guys, Will and Marshall and Aaron, went on a morning hike, and they crossed the creek right by our camp. And they were gone for a couple of hours when they came back basically at the opening of that trailhead at the end of the meadow. The 4 of us went on a hike in the afternoon, and we both left and came back via that trailhead, and none of us saw anything out of the ordinary. The next morning, I woke up at about 5:30, and everybody else was asleep, and I decided to go for a hike, and I was going to go down to that trailhead. And Will he was in the last campground by the trailhead, and he was just getting up as well, and he was starting his fire. And we talked for a couple of minutes, and I said, I'll be back in 10 or 15 minutes. I'm just going to go for a quick hike. And I got down to right before the trailhead, and all of a sudden I noticed 2 sticks, probably about 5 feet long each, making an X on the ground. They weren't up in the air. They were laying on the ground, essentially right in front of the trailhead. And it was so obvious. I started thinking, how did I miss that the night before when we got back from our hike around 4:30 or 5? And so I went back before I went on my hike, and I went back to get Will, and I asked him, had they seen it when they got done with their hike? And he said no. And eventually everybody gets up. Nobody had seen it. We've even gone back and looked at pictures and some drone footage that Will had taken. It was not there before on any of the pictures, and none of us had seen it when we passed that. So somewhere between 4:35 when we got back in the evening from our hike, and then 5:30 in the morning when I was hiking out the trailhead, something had placed those sticks on the ground, forming an X. There were people camped probably a quarter mile away. We never saw anybody come into the meadow. So what put it there, I don't know. But that spot, we didn't know it at the time, but in August, our August trip, something else happened at that exact spot.
So Jonathan and Sarah had shown up around Friday afternoon around dusk, and after they got settled in, they came over, and our camp was the bigger one, so we had a campfire around that area, and we're just telling stories about what happened on their property. And their channel was Solis Sasquatch channel, that you can see what they've recorded and stuff. But around 11:30, we all heard a tree knock behind our camp, and these are all close to our camp that we're hearing this. And about 5 minutes later, so the tree knock was behind where our tent was in our camp, but then we heard a twig snap or a noise about 100 yards in the opposite direction in the meadow from where the camp was. So, of course, we all grabbed our thermals and went over and started walking to that area. And we're standing there, and Will started speculating. He goes, well, there might be two individuals here, because whatever made that knock over here has not had enough time to quietly walk over to this area where we heard this break. So if there's two of them, I think we're going to hear another response from this other side. And crazy enough, a few minutes later, we get a knock back from the other direction. And it's like, I don't know anything about Bigfoot. That was pretty cool that he had predicted that was going to happen.
And just to quickly interrupt and give a perspective for people who don't have a picture of where all this occurred, those two knocks came from basically the same place where Candy's little rock had been moved, and also where the year before those individuals had run through the camp and everybody, David and those two campers, heard Sierra sounds. So same basic area right behind that one campsite.
And so as we're looking around our thermals, also Will notices that a motion light goes off in his camp that's at the end of the meadow from our camp. So he goes over to investigate, and I'm looking at my thermal down the meadow, and I just saw a quick motion right on the edge. I could not tell what it was. I know it was on the edge of the meadow right across from his camp. I couldn't say what size it was. I just saw a quick heat signature, just boom, move out. So that was interesting when he had that motion light come on, and he had it set up so it wasn't going to go off for limbs moving or trees moving or things like that. And there was no wind at that point with that.
So yeah, all that had occurred in about 10 or 15 minutes. Basically, the meadow was surrounded by knocks, a branch break, and a motion light going off at all three corners of the meadow, basically. So the next day, Sarah and Jonathan did their filming and interviews, and so did Will. And that evening, all of us got around the campfire again, because that's when we had told stories, and that's when everything had happened the night before. And not a lot had really happened that night. We kind of stayed up till about 12:30, 12:45, just talking, and then we all went to bed. And about an hour after that, David and I were both awakened by multiple barred owls calling from around the whole valley. And I think I sent you an audio of that, but you can tell there are probably 3 or 4 different volumes of the barred owl. And they went for about 4 or 5 minutes. And right in the middle on the audio, it sounds like a high-pitched shriek. When David and I talked about it the next morning, we both thought we had heard monkey chatter, ooh, ee, in the middle of the night during that 5 to 10 second span where the high-pitched shriek was. We've had some people listen to it. Nobody really knows what it was. Some people say it's an owl, and that owls can do a high-pitched shriek. But even if it was an owl, I told you that it seemed like a lot of these owl calls seem to precede other things happening, or come after other things happened. That was our last night there. We all went back home, and the next morning, Will sent us a video about a week or 2 later, and he has now about a week ago published that video, so you can go to his channel if you want to see it. He had moved his thermal to a different part of the meadow to try to get a view of Candy's camp, or Candy's tent, in case that individual came back and tried touching her again. And so instead of looking long ways down the meadow, he was looking across the meadow. And he started reviewing all of that video from that night, and it was a thermal video. And he noticed something looked like a head, just a white hot head, peeking out from behind a tree. And he has about a 30-minute period where this white blob, you can see it slowly come out from behind the tree and go back. Slowly come out, go back. It probably came out, what would you say, David, 30 or 40 times in that 30 minutes? I don't know. Quite a few.
Yeah, at the end, he decided he had to adjust his thermal to the left, but it had been there for 30 minutes, and it was there before he started it, right when he started his thermal, and it was there when he had moved it. So I don't know how long it stayed there, but it definitely was reacting. Like when someone would walk by the truck or something like that, it would definitely move back, and they would go back to the campfire. It would come back out, and there's a couple spots that you can see on his video where it actually looked pretty big. So we I don't know, that was after he got the video about a week or two after we got back from that. And so he was wanting to get back and do a recreation of that.
We ended up doing that recreation in August. We'll talk more about our August trip, but just since it's related to this, Bill Bisson, who's Selkirk Mountain Sasquatch, came with us in the August trip, and he sort of acted as our peeker. We found the tree that the thing had been looking, whatever it was coming out with the head. That tree was 60 feet from our campfire. That's it. And the reason you don't see any more of the body is there's a berm of dirt. And so it could not peek the other way and see us. It had to peek only one way. And so it kept coming out. And in the recreation, Bill is 6'2". He's a big guy. The average human head is about 6 inches from side to side, 6 to 6.5 inches. And this thing was just under 50% wider than Bill's head. So probably was about 8.5 inches across. And I did some research. Andre the Giant, who was 7'4", 500 pounds, his head was 8 inches side to side. So that gives you an estimate of the size of whatever was looking at us in the middle of the night. And it's a crazy video. You may not want to watch a half hour of it, but he put the whole half hour there so you could see how many times it came out. And he has a scale. He was able to line up Bill's head and the individual's head, and you can see with the ruler, it's almost 50% wider. The other interesting thing, you could see Bill's neck. You could not see a neck on this individual. You just saw a head.
Yeah.
So that kind of ended our June trip to Gypsy Meadows. And we had decided we were going to go back one more time in August, and we had a number of things that happened there too.
So both of those trips, you're traveling 2,000 miles to get there.
Correct.
1,000 each way.
Oh my goodness, guys. That is so intense. Wow.
Probably, maybe we wouldn't be going back if things didn't keep happening, but now that they are happening, we'll probably always, even though Candy said she wants to go all around the country, our heart is at Gypsy Meadows now. We'll probably always at some point return to do some more observation.
Yeah, we understand that it's very unusual for something to happen every time we've gone out. And we know that 90% of the time you go out Bigfooting, you're not going to find anything or see anything, but we've been very fortunate in what we've done. So we had discussed before, we didn't know what was going to happen when we went up with Sarah and John, and it was great to meet Will and Marshall. But we had decided before we went up there that we wanted to go back at the same time that we had been there the year before. So we had already planned to go back in August at the same week that we had been there. So even though we had done the trip with them, it was already in the works for it. So when we were going back, I got a hold of Will and said, "Hey, we're going up. Do you want to come join us?" And he said, "Yeah, that'd be great." And he really wanted to come back up and recreate that situation with the thermal. And we had put my truck in the same spot and and everything to make it just the way it was. So he was glad to come up, and we had a good time when there. So when Will came, he decided to stay. They stayed in the campground that was out by the bathroom area where the other gentleman had witnessed that all tan Sasquatch. So when we got there, we met Randy Lute. He was the gentleman who had seen that Sasquatch in 2024. He had been seeing Will's videos and Celeste Sasquatch's videos, and he was like, I was there. I met those guys. So he decided that he wanted to come up. We had said we were going up in August at the same week, so he came up there again and camped in the same spot. What was interesting is he told the story that we had said that we had thought that the Bigfoot had come out from the creek by the bathroom and out, and that was wrong. And Will did a good interview with him describing that interaction, and it actually said that the Bigfoot had, or Sasquatch that we think it was, that's what it was, actually following Curtis and I as we walked out the road from the meadow to the bathroom. I had gone into the bathroom and Curtis had kept going out to the main road, and he had seen this thing come along the opposite side of the road to the end of that area and turn and go back into the woods and then up the ridge where we keep talking, or all those things keep happening. So it was interesting that it was following us, not just randomly walking across from the bathroom like we had thought it had. That's what we had thought he had told us. And when I told Curtis, I go, that we have got to get our game up, because we don't walk down that road. We're walking and looking and listening and paying attention when we're walking. And if someone's going to follow us like that and us not know it, that is amazing that we're missing that. So it really opened my eyes up to say, hey, we need to do something better from that if we're going to miss something like that by 30 seconds. That morning, we had multiple calls. We didn't get it on the audio. The first night that I got my audio out, we camped at the same campsite we did in 24, the same campsite that Will camped in June. And there's a weather station up about 30 yards up on the ridge above the camp. It's a rain collection place, and they have a post there. And I thought a good place to go put an audio up there. So I went and I put one of my audio recorders up there. And that when I reviewed my audio, I'm getting, the first night, I get these, it's a bang, and I don't know what it was. Will recorded it from his camp. It was a lot quieter than from my camp, but it sounds like a drum, like if someone has a steel drum and they're banging it. It's just a single bang. And I have about probably 30 of those bangs throughout the week of recorded. And I don't know where they're coming from. But this first night I was recording, and I heard this, it's a voice of it's like a young or a female voice talking right before the bang. And then it talks 2 or 3 times after the bang. And I don't know what it is. It was in the language. I can't recognize the words or what's being said, but it sounds like a female type voice in there. And it's coming from the ridge up above our camp. There's nothing back there. It's woods and forest, and it's 2 a.m. And so what that was, I don't know, but it's an interesting audio. And I think I sent that to you.
Yeah, I can play it real quick. It's from August 24th, that one.
Yeah.
It's like a quick one. Yeah. Okay. Here we
Correct.
go.
Yeah, that's it.
One more time. It's so weird.
Yeah, crazy. We hadn't heard that. We'd slept right through it. The next morning, we decided, David and I, to go on a hike across the creek into the wilderness. And we just barely got to the creek, which was probably 150 to 200 feet away from our camp is all. And we got to this little place where the creek sort of went around a little sandbar. And right in the middle of the sandbar, this pebbly kind of sandy area, we found a 12-inch print where you could see toes. And I think we scanned it and sent you the scan of that as well. And we eventually casted it. But to put that in perspective, that's it. To put that in perspective, David and I both wear size 13. Our foot is about 11 and a half inches. So if this was a human, their foot had to be a size 14 shoe, give or take, to do that. Later in the day, a lady came in at the end of the meadow and she brought 2 horses in a trailer and 2 dogs. And we were wondering if that would affect any of the activity in the area. But we mentioned her coming in only because it does play a role, a quick little story a couple days later. The second evening, we didn't really hear much except for some owls. But about 3 a.m, David had bought a motion light, and similar to Will's, he set it so it was a branch moving wasn't going to set it off. And all of a sudden, our light goes off at 3 a.m, and we both heard footsteps going through the camp. What it was, I don't know. But again, we had cameras and thermal all around, and this was probably in a dead zone where all the cameras might have been pointed towards.
And about Tuesday evening, about 9 o'clock, Curtis and me are playing cribbage. Will comes down to our camp and he says, "Hey, I just had a large tree break right behind my tent." And that's like within 20 yards of his camp. And then he was followed by a loud whoop. So we hadn't set up our thermals at that time yet. So we decided to go ahead and get our thermals that we had bought and set up. And we're overlooking the meadow, and then one we put Curtis's up on the ridge behind us. And while we're setting up our thermals, all of a sudden we hear a knock to the northwest where we had previously, in the previous year, put gifts up in that area. Nothing had taken the gifts, but it was about 100 yards to the northeast of where we were was that knock. So then we decided to sit there for about an hour or two in front of a truck and just listen. And we started hearing like 4 whoops in the same direction of the knock. And then this was followed by strange barred owls. They're calling back and forth. And then all of a sudden we started hearing these weird duck sounds coming from the direction of the first knock. And I think I sent you that audio too. And I'm going like, what? We got ducks in the forest now? And there's no ponds or water for these ducks to be sitting in around here, just in the middle of forest coming from the woods. And I go, now we got ducks. And so that was an interesting audio there too. The other thing, we had 2 different whistles in the meadow in the tree line, and another whoop came from down by the creek. And then we had another knock that was coming from the gifting site that we had recorded duck sounds from.
So we are going to play an audio right now that does have a bit of static on it. I would recommend turning down the volume for people that are listening. And let me do that as well a little bit. Okay, here we go.
So those were probably 10 p.m., 11 p.m. that night. Perhaps, again, many of those might be barred owls, but we also, as David said, heard knocks and whistles, and then whatever was making that other sound that to our naked ear sounded like ducks had occurred around 10 p.m. So we went to bed, and we had set up our thermals when Will had come down, like David said, and our thermals were brand new. We didn't know how long the batteries would last. So about 5 a.m, we both were awakened by rain starting to come down, and we both decided to get out of bed and go get our thermals so they wouldn't get damaged. And we brought them in, and as we were bringing in our thermals, we heard some more hoots, owl hoots, like those same ones. Then we heard a whoop, and those were coming from that same gifting area that David was talking about. And just to put that in perspective, that gifting area is probably 50 to 75 yards in the trailhead, in from that trailhead where we found the X. So all those sounds were coming from there. And then down at the other end of the meadow at 5 a.m. when we went to get our thermals, we heard a couple of whistles. So 2 different areas, 2 different sounds. And then it quieted down. And after we brought in our thermals, David decided to go back to bed. And about 5:30, I decided I'm going to go for a walk. And it was still pretty dark. Sunrise wasn't until 5:56 that morning. And I was going to walk down to basically that bathroom area in that other campground where that Randy Lute had seen a tan Bigfoot the year before. And I was just going for a walk. And, that Gypsy Meadows is in a valley. It's surrounded on 3 sides by mountains. So even if sunrise was 25, 30 minutes away, it was still pretty dark. You could maybe see a little light. There wasn't much at all. Definitely could not see colors or anything like that. I went back and looked at the phase of the moon, and it was a waxing moon with only about 10%. And moonrise wasn't even until 9:55. So there was no light of the moon at all that morning. And I got down to the bathroom area, and in one of your pictures that showed Gypsy Meadows right off of the main road, there's an entrance to both campgrounds. If you go to the right, you go to Gypsy Meadows. If you go to the left, you go to the other campground where Will was staying, Bill Basson, and this Randy Lute. So you can see both little roads there. And the little roads are probably each about 10 feet across. They're 1-lane roads. They come together there off of the main road. And I got to that fork, and I just decided to look down towards Will's camp, which was where that arrow is pointed down to the left there. And I saw what I thought was Will standing out in front of his camp. And the reason I thought it was Will has a light jacket. At that time in the morning, I can't tell colors, but I see this figure from about waist up standing behind a bush. And my mind just went to Will standing there looking or listening. And so I waved real quick, and in the 3 or 4 steps that I took across that 10-foot road, Will did not wave back. And I didn't really think much of it. We later lasered that distance. It was 80 yards. So I thought either he didn't see me because it was still pretty dark. So I came out to the main road, which is on the right there, took it down about 100 yards, and it loops back into that campground, and that loop comes out where you can see it right there. And when I got to Will's camp, he wasn't there, and nothing was standing behind that bush. So I then spent the next 15 to 20 minutes trying to figure out, was this Will? Was this one of the other campers, Randy or Bill Basson? I literally went into each campground. I didn't want to scare anybody or anything. I would take 10 steps in, look, listen. Nobody was up. And just across the road and down about another 50 yards, there is one other campsite, and a family had come in the night before. So I even walked down there and peeked into their campsite to see if anybody was up. Nobody was up. So about probably a half hour later, and I'm looking around this whole time, I think there's even game cameras showing me looking around. So I clearly was looking for something. And about half hour after that, Will had gotten up, and I asked him, were you up an hour ago or a half hour ago standing in front of your camp? And he said, no, but about a half hour before that, his motion light had gone off and he saw a shadow on his tent. Now the shadow did not come up very high on his tent, so he thought it was probably a bear or something, and it didn't cause him any concern. He didn't get out of his bed. So eventually everybody gets up and nobody had been standing there. And we started to recreate it, and David stood behind that bush. And I went back out to that fork, and I looked down and I suddenly realized this thing was much larger than David. I could not tell size when it was dark, and I couldn't tell color. And I was 80 yards away. But it was clearly taller than David for a couple of reasons. I saw this thing from about mid-abdomen up. David, standing behind the bush, I could see him just from armpits up. And I remembered that I saw the top of this individual's head at about the level of a branch. And so I started to have David raise his hand, and he got his hand as far extended as he could, and he was just barely coming to that edge of that branch. So whatever had been there, we estimated was probably between 7.5 and 8 feet tall. And if you remember back to Randy Lute's description of a tan Bigfoot, all I saw was a light color. I couldn't tell color because it was dark. I couldn't tell if it was tan. My mind just went to, oh, that's got to be Will, because it's standing in front of his campground, and Will has a light colored jacket. So whatever I saw was gone after about 45 seconds.
So after we did that, Curtis realized he probably saw a Sasquatch there. And we were trying to discuss that with Will and Randy and all them. We did pull the game cameras from Randy's, and it shows Curtis looking around and walking in and things like that. It was pretty cool that he got to see something even though he didn't know he saw it.
And once again, it was in a dead zone.
Yeah.
Because when I got to that spot, I didn't trigger the cameras. It wasn't until I got closer to Randy's camp by about 30 feet that you see me looking around. You can see that spot once the camera is triggered, but from that spot, those game cameras were far enough away that they wouldn't be triggered. So once again, somehow they're either lucky or they're good or both, but they missed all the game cameras that were pointed in that direction.
So that afternoon, all 5 of us, we took a hike across the creek. Will found a 12.5-inch print, pretty good print in some good sand. And he went and casted it, and I think he posted that casting on his Grassman 58 channel. But it definitely had toes. Curtis scanned it with his scanner. So we found out later on that evening that the lady who had come into the meadow, she had two horses and 2 dogs. And one of them had been missing for 2 days. And apparently she had gone on a trail ride with her dogs and went down to the creek bed to the left of where we were camping in June, and to water her horses and the dogs. And she had a feral dog that she had adopted. And all of a sudden it just started shaking and getting really scared and took off. And it wouldn't come back into camp for 2 days. We'd see it out on the main road once in a while. We'd see it walking around, but it took about 2 days for her to be able to catch that dog before she had left. And so something had scared that dog when they were down by the creek over there. And that was in the same direction that we had seen the Peeker and Will's video in June with that. We did go for a night hike. There's a historic copper mine camp. It's bound by campsite 16. That's along Sullivan Lake Road there, and it was gated off, so we parked and walked up there, and that was cool to go at night. We didn't see anything at that point. The next day, though, we decided to go back up to the same marsh that we had found those 16.5-inch footprints the year before, and the ones that had a 48-inch step length. So I go, we got to go back up there and look. So we go up there, and going around the marsh, we find another really awesome footprint. But that was a 15.5, and the step length on that one was 60 inches. It was 60. It was amazing to the next one. But that print was half of it was you could see the water in the heel, and you could see the toes on the front of it. So it was too wet to cast or anything like that. But we took those pictures and videoed that.
Just to put 60 inches into perspective, in a human, if you had a 60-inch step right foot to left foot, that would make you 12 feet tall.
Oh, wow.
Now, I do not know Bigfoot anatomy. I know human anatomy, but that just is a crazy step distance.
And then I think I sent you a picture of the right over the top of it too.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah, that's them.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
it.
So there's
So you
one
can
there.
definitely see the toes on that, and
Oh yeah.
and the heel with the water in the heel part with that. So that night I woke up around 2:30. We had two whistles. We got up to look around the camp. We didn't see anything. And I went back to bed, and I was just laying in bed there. And all of a sudden I get this odor by my right side of my tent. And it's just a sulfur, bad smelling odor. And it was only there for about 3 to 5 seconds. And then it disappeared. And I was going, is something just walked through our tent? Because most of the time, like, odor is not going to stick around, but it just came and disappeared within about 15 seconds. So that was an interesting smell. So I told Curtis about that the next morning.
And I had slept through that. I didn't know that had occurred. He didn't tell me till later in the morning. But again, I'm an early riser, and that morning I woke up at 5:30. And most days I either went for a walk, or I'd go bring the thermals in, or check the batteries on the audio, or just do something until David got up. So I woke up at 5:30, like I said, walked out into the meadow to get David's thermal to bring it in. And I brought it in and set it under our awning in our campsite. And I was going to go get my thermal, which was up on the ridge behind our camp, but I decided I was going to brush my teeth. And I walked down this gravel driveway that goes into our campsite. And about halfway down, I turned to the right to go towards the bear box where I had my toothpaste. So I opened the bear box, got out my toothpaste, started brushing my teeth. And all of a sudden behind me, I heard this thud and then a clack. So something had clearly thrown a rock that landed in a patch of dirt behind me and then landed on this gravel driveway. And I couldn't tell which rock it was because there were 10,000 rocks in this gravel driveway, and they were all about the same size. But I realized something had thrown a rock at me, and I quickly turned and scanned the tree line across the meadow. And again, here's where I have to learn to think out of the box. I basically looked at the spot closest to our camp, which is probably 25 yards away, thinking that if in order to throw one of those little rocks and have it land in the dirt and then dribble onto the driveway, that's where it had to be. I couldn't see anything, so David's thermal was only 20 or 30 feet away. I went and got it and scanned probably 45 degrees each way. Unfortunately, I did not look clear to the right because I figured just in my brain that was too far away for something to throw a rock. Saw nothing on the thermal, but I parked the thermal where I thought the rock had come from and sat down and listened for things. And I ended up hearing a knock from that same gifting area, and then a whistle down by the creek, So the gifting area was to our right, or my right, as I was sitting down watching, and the creek was to the left. And probably about 20 minutes later, David woke up and finally told me that a couple of hours before that he smelled something. And then David had an idea, and he walked into the tree line there.
So I got up around 6 and told him about the smell, and he told me about he had a rock thrown at him. So I was going, okay. And he had the camera pointed directly across the camp into the tree line. So I walked into the tree line, and he thermaled me going in there. But I was looking to see if I could find something, and I worked my way. I went into the game trail and started following that around into there was a dry creek area in there, and I was just looking for prints or looking for anything in that area. And I kept walking out, and I come out towards where at the end of the meadow is that there's 2 rocks that go into the trail that goes out into the wilderness area. And I come out to the left side of that, and there's another game trail right there. And I find 2 footprints in the pine needles. It was a definite print, and you could see toes on it, and the impression had to be heavy because it was pretty hard ground on that. It was like a left-footed print, and then there was another one at a 90-degree angle off to the right that was embedded in the ground. And you could see my truck from that area if you're looking and peeking out to watch what Curtis is doing out there with the game cameras and all that. But then when Curtis walks back to the bear box, you can't see him. And at that point, I saw where I think whatever threw the rock moved forward to this open area where he could stand and have cover and just lean out and throw a rock. And so it was interesting that right where I thought that they were going to be throwing from, which was to the right of us when Curtis was not in sight, is when they would throw the rock. That's where I found the 16.5-inch print, and about 5.5-inch wide, I think, was the print when we measured that. So it had a perfect view of the camp. You couldn't see Curtis when he was in the bear box. So when we started measuring that, the laser about 51 yards.
Yes.
That it had to be thrown. So when we recreated it, neither of us got close to within 10 yards of the distance of that when we were throwing rocks with it. We talked to Will since our trip, and he got a report he posted in the last video of someone else who was staying at the same campsite that reported rocks being thrown at them also.
But where David found those prints, this kind of ties the story from June where I found that X. Those were right by the trailhead, right where we found that X coming off the trail in June. Same basic area where he found 2 prints in August, and something probably is where something threw a rock at me, is the same place that after we all went hiking that day, an X showed up on the ground the next morning. And that's also the area probably 50 yards more into the forest there where David recorded all those barred owl sounds and duck-like sounds that you played that had a lot of static in them. So that area, and then the area at the other end of the meadow where Candy was touched, seemed to be the busiest areas in Gypsy Meadows. And they're both on opposite ends of the meadow, and they both have good tree coverage where things can hide easily.
Yeah, and Will posted the video of our investigation and document of finding those prints and stuff on his channel, and I think it's titled After Hours on his channel. But one thing that I had thought about with my interest in the Native American Sign Language was that Curtis had actually communicated with that Sasquatch, and by waving at it, and the Sasquatch had seen him wave, he knew that Curtis had seen him, and by waving, Curtis was communicating. And I don't know if the rock throw was another communication. He wasn't trying to hit Curtis because Curtis was out of sight at that time, but maybe that was the same thing that happened when I was in my hammock and had the rock thrown close to me, because it didn't hit me either. I went out into the woods again at that spot and did more Native American sign to the woods. Maybe no one was watching, but I was hoping that something was watching. with that. So that night we decided to, okay, I'm going to put my thermal not going down the meadow, but I'm actually going to put it into the woods down that game trail where that was. And so it was shining, it was watching right down the game trail. And then about 3 a.m, my motion light went off. And then I heard this mad barred owl come from across the meadow, and it was angry, and it was right where my thermal camera was. And it was just angry and took off and started walking back towards the gifting area. And about for 15 minutes, it was just going off, and you could hear it moving and going all the way out to the gifting area, then back around across the creek and back into the woods. And I was going, something was angry. And I was like, hey, it didn't like me putting a thermal camera in the middle of a game trail in the woods there. But it went off in the same direction where we had heard those strange ducks and barred owls and all that in that same gifting area.
So, David, when you're hearing the angry barred owl, you're also hearing something walking in the woods at the same time?
I didn't hear anything walking. It's about 50 feet away, but I could follow the direction of where it's coming from.
Oh, sure. Yep.
The angriness started right where my thermal camera was, and it was in the tree line, and it just moved to the north back to where that guy had thrown the rock, and then into the gifting area. And then it seemed like it kept turning back the direction, crossing the creek, and then going back towards the other end of the meadow on the other side of the creek. But it was about 15 minutes. It just went off, and it was like, you could tell anger. It wasn't just a normal hoot, it was just hooting away and just angry, And so that was really strange with it. That's how our trip ended at that point.
Is anyone actively researching this area more than once or twice a year that you know of?
No.
Wow.
Will spends a fair amount of time down below. So this is probably 11 miles, I believe, up Sullivan Creek Road. And where he has done most of his research in the area is probably 2 or 3 miles closer to Sullivan Lake. He has come here twice with us. And just to put it in perspective, if you still have that picture up that I see, the road to the right is Sullivan Creek Road. It ends about 1.5 miles in the direction that picture is looking at the Salmo Priest Wilderness Trailhead. So there's beyond this, there's not much. And so Gypsy Meadows is just on that road going forward that you can see between the trees. It's probably 200 or 300 yards in there. And just across the creek, which borders Gypsy Meadows, the Salmo Priest Wilderness starts. So there's not much beyond here. To our knowledge, nobody else is researching this area. There may be, but I've looked at a lot of videos. There have been a number of reports, however, I've seen on YouTube of people having rocks thrown at them in this area. Will had that one that called him shortly after he heard our video. And the guy said the same thing the week before we were there in August. He had rocks thrown at him in that same campground. So there have been reports from the area, but I have not seen at least anybody on YouTube who has done research exactly in Gypsy Meadows.
That's wild. Yeah. Will's one of those guys. I need to reach out to him. I probably could have a good conversation with him as well about, I haven't really talked a lot about or had a lot of conversations about, it's a northeast corner of Washington, right?
Yes, it's about as far north and as far east as you can go in Washington. We're probably 5 miles from the Canadian border and maybe 8 miles from the Idaho border. So it's up there.
After really year 2 going there, have your feelings toward the area changed at all? Do you think, is it, is even more that, yes, there's a Sasquatch there, or what are your feelings towards the area after the second year?
Yeah, I think that there definitely stuff there. Like I said, we've had things happen every single time we've gone. So I think, like Curtis said, we're attached to it. As far as I go, it's a heck of a long way to go. It's over 1,000 miles up there, but we definitely enjoy it every time we go up there. I think there's other areas that we can go to. I've had local contact of some hunters that want to meet with me that have got some areas up here by Sonora Pass. They're interested in taking me up in that area. My son, he wants us to come out there and take him out. He's a total skeptic, though. He doesn't believe in this. But he wants to come hear what we're talking about. So luckily, Curtis is retired and is able to do all this research and stuff. Watch all these. I get videos every day from Curtis.
Sorry, Candy.
Candy has to listen to them. But so we're stuck. We're going down the rabbit hole. I know we're going to be going back to Gypsy Meadows at some point. We got an invite to the guy up in Gifford Pinchot to come up in the spring.
The guy with the map. The
map. We haven't finalized that yet, but we're probably going to do that, and maybe in the summer go again up to Washington and see if we can take our bait with us to get the Sasquatch out again.
Wow, that is super, super exciting. And it is cool that you do have some potential things going on in your area that you could look into, maybe some leads. That's something I was going to ask here at the end, is if you've ever considered looking into stuff around your kind of home base area. And that's cool to always have that as a backup plan for sure. But man, yeah, I get it. Once you get that one area, for me, it's just outside of Oak Ridge, Oregon, and I'll go back out there every year until I can't go out there anymore. It really draws you to it. It's a weird thing. And I'm sure so Candy, what are your feelings? Do you get it now? You get it like the draw to go back to a place, or what are your feelings towards all this?
Yeah, I think being a newbie like I am, and then on my very first outing, I find prints, I hear noises, I whistle and get responses. I get touched in my tent. My rock gets moved every night. I would say that was a pretty good first time out for someone who was on the fence and not really, I don't know about this. I'm not sure if this is really real or not, but going out and having the experience is completely different. You have to go out. You have to see, you have to hear. It's not the same watching it on TV. You have to go
100%. Yeah. And don't just go out by yourself. I know you guys know, I'm talking to the listeners.
Yeah.
If there's someone out there, oh yeah, I'm going to go by myself the first time. Probably not. Probably you should go with someone who knows what they're doing. Just so you can learn the ropes. I would recommend that being a good idea.
David and I didn't take your recommendation.
That's true.
California.
But you guys weren't like out by yourselves, though.
Right. We went together.
Yeah.
We went together. We had researched it ahead of time.
Yep.
We had protection. We had first aid. We're both doctors, so we felt comfortable. And going back to that trip, we thought it was a backpacking trip. We never, ever, we called it a Bigfooting trip, but we never, ever expected to find anything. So we've been extremely lucky. We thought we were just going backpacking in California. And then all those things happened. And like you said, we're now hooked and probably going to continue to do it till, like you said, we can't do it anymore.
Absolutely. Yeah. And listeners, we've talked about a few other YouTube channels. I'll have those linked in the comments. And this whole time for them to go up again was really cool because it was documented a few different ways. So you can actually see, I think it's actually documented on Jonathan and Sarah Brown's channel about the Gifford Pinchot stuff too, right? I think that's an interesting video.
She has a short out just with the audio sounds, and then she has a whole, probably about 3 weeks ago, put out maybe a 30-minute video on what they found at Gifford Pinchot. And that was literally 2 or 3 days before we were in the same campsite that they were in.
Okay. Gotcha. Man, guys, what a crazy update. Just some fantastic news to share from you guys. Thank you for coming on the show and for sharing what you've experienced this second year out to these places. And who knows what the future will bring. Man, if guys or if people, do you have a way for people to contact you if they want to reach out and be like, hey, I've been to Gypsy Meadows too, and I had the same thing happen? I can't remember if last time we had any contact way or.
Yeah, that's fine. I think you have my email.
Okay.
I don't know if you can put that on the info.
Oh yeah.
On the video, or we don't even probably have them email us, and then we can give them our number or something like that. I think you have David's contact info too. We're happy to have people call us. We want to hear about that stuff. We just were contacted probably 2 or 3 weeks ago by another guy who was in Gifford Pinchot, and he saw some of the stuff that we had talked about, and he's comparing his vocalizations to ones we found. So that, like I said, we got into this as newbies 3 years ago, and without you and Jonathan and Will and Matt Knapp, we'd still be on our own, but we now have these connections that we would have never had. And it's great because we hear stuff from these people, they hear stuff from us, and sometimes it's not what you want to hear. No, that's an owl, or that's nothing. That's not a footprint. Don't worry about it. But it's still good to get someone who has more knowledge and more foundation in this than we have. So we appreciate you having us on again.
Absolutely. Thank you all for coming on. Curtis Miller, David, Candy Fuller. It's a pleasure meeting you for the first time, Candy, as well.
Yes,
And
you too.
definitely keep me in the loop with any other things that happen to you guys in the future. But thanks for coming on today.
Hey,
Thanks,
thanks,
Jeremiah.
Jeremiah.
Thank you.